Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for asking me to come all the way from Huddersfield to Manchester, Manchester to London to do this talk. I just feel really honoured. I was just saying to Samuel, I'm doing this because I feel really honoured to have somebody like this man in my life and in my family. I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of Robert Rashid Stanley. I didn't know this until quite recently in my life, and nobody else did, and that's the entire point of this story and this history. It was covered up. We can talk about why towards the end of the talk or in the question and answer session later on. So we only found out late 1990s about this history, and I'm going to explain. Going to dash through his 83 years in 20 minutes, if I may. Normally I make this talk last for an hour, and I can do it for 10 hours because I am so captivated by this amazing person and what he's brought to our family and to my life. So without further ado, let's see if I can move this along. So we found out about Robert Stanley when my dad was made redundant. My dad was a truck mechanic, HGV vehicles, up in Manchester, and he was made redundant. He was quite sad to be made redundant, but also quite happy because he'd always wanted to look into his family history. Before I continue, I just need to make sure you all know where Staylor Bridge is, because I'll be talking about that a lot. Those of you, some of you might have been to Staylor Bridge if you're lucky enough. It's on the east side of Manchester, about 7 or 8 miles east of Manchester, right on the edge of the Pennines, right on the edge of Yorkshire, and that's where all my family are from, that's where I'm from. So we've got this strange kind of accent, Lancashire, Yorkshire, and this is how it all began. So my dad told everybody he was looking into the family history, and when you're doing family history, you always tend to go for the person that is, you might have a little bit of information on, and he knew that his great-great-granddad had been a mayor of Staylor Bridge, no less, very prestigious. So he started looking into that, and an elderly relative, said that he had got a little magazine that featured this Robert Stanley in, and would my dad like to have it? So he handed it to my dad, and it was just exactly as we heard earlier on. It was a copy of the magazine, the first Muslim periodical publication in Britain called The Crescent. Now my dad, not being a religious person, had no idea what the significance of that was. In it, this magazine is published by a man called Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, and in April 1907 the edition describes Robert Stanley as a distinguished British Mussulman. Now my dad had no idea what a Mussulman was, not that sort, He kind of had an inkling when he saw the photograph, and that's the photograph. And every single time we look at this photograph, my daughter said to me yesterday, it's Grandad. If you see a photograph of my dad, which there is later on, he is the absolute image, beard, everything about him. So this is almost like seeing a photograph of my dad wearing a fez. So the clue was the fez as to what had happened to this amazing person. And so my dad thinking, well, I think I know what's gone on there. And according to this article written by this Quilliam guy, I think I know what's happened. So he asked my big brother. And the really strange thing about this story is my brother converted to Islam in 1991. So it was about 10 years from my brother being a Muslim to finding out that his own great-great-great-grandfather had also become a Muslim. And I should say, we're not a particularly religious family. I'm a Christian, as is my mother, but everybody else kind of never had anything much to do with religion. So for my brother to convert in 1991, when you just didn't get working class boys from Staylor Bridge converting to Islam, and then finding out, wow, I am not the only person walking around this side of Manchester who's white and who has done this. My own great-great-great-grandfather did it before me. And then the really strange thing is another relative, when my dad sent this story round about what we'd found out, another relative said, well, I think I've got something that belonged to him, the fez. So this is the actual fez in that photograph that the Muslims at the Liverpool Mosque, the first mosque, wore. And for some reason, the uncle who'd kept it had no idea why. I think he might have thought that maybe it was from a pantomime, because, this is the 70s, the 80s. We grew up thinking fez as Tommy Cooper. It meant nothing more culturally to our family than that. But somebody kept it, and that was a bit of tingle down the back of the neck moment. Then my granny, obviously his great-granddaughter, she died shortly after this discovery was made. She'd never been told anything about this. She just knew he was the mayor of Stalybridge. And in her jewellery box, we found a little pin, a star and crescent of Islam. And immediately my brother said, well, I think I know where that's from. And she knew that it had been her great-granddad's, but she'd no idea what the significance of the star and the crescent was there. So again, something else that we kept with absolutely nothing written down. And I cannot emphasise this enough. This is a working class man. This is a working class story. Working class people in Britain did not write things down. Didn't have the time. They were in factories, they were in shops, they were working every single hour. Even if they were lucky enough to be educated and to know how to read and write, it was quite a self-indulgent thing to sit down and write diaries, like middle class and upper class people would do. So we had nothing written, absolutely nothing. So I then got told I had to go and do the research, because my brother did, oh, you know, you're the writer, you go off and write it. And I kept saying, but this is your story, you know, you're the Muslim in the family. He said, it isn't, it's everybody's story. This is a story that brings something to everybody. So I hit the archives and I went through the town council minutes, and it took me quite a few days before I finally found his signature. And I must admit, I was really emotional just seeing his name in his own handwriting there. So that's the one and only signature that we've got of Robert Stanley in the minutes in Ashton-under-Lyne at the library. So I pieced all of this together, and this was really hard to do. It's not like if you've ever gone online and looked at history or family history online. This stuff isn't online. You can't just type in Robert Stanley and it brings up his family history. I had to go back to the old microfiche, basically. Those of you who are probably my age, you might remember doing research. You have to get the old pieces of film and put them on a machine and scroll it. And that's because these newspapers from Manchester have not been digitised yet. And that's because the British Archives have not yet digitised this part of Manchester, which was the most radical place for the Industrial Revolution. And I keep getting really angry every time I do this talk because it made my eyes go completely crazy, and my eyesight's terrible now. So these newspapers, if we had them digitised, all of you guys could go out there and do your own research. But at the moment, you have to go up north and go through the old-fashioned way of doing it. So my dad found out that Robert was born in Cardiff. Now, there's a huge story behind as to why our family went to from Stalybridge, went down to Cardiff. But he was born in Cardiff in 1828. He was sent back at the age of 10 to Manchester. So this happened a lot with working class families. They'd move the family to another part of England. Times were hard. You'd send your 10-year-old boy, like Robert was, back to live with family to earn some money. So Robert went to work in a shop. Dad found Robert's wedding certificate, and he was married in something called the Sanctuary of the Christian Israelites in Ashton-under-Lyne, which just sounded like an interesting group of Christians, but it really wasn't. There's even been a BBC TV programme made about this, a fiction programme called Mr. Rose Virgins, which is just fascinating. A really unusual Christian sect. And again, I could talk about them for an hour because they were really interesting people. That picture up there, and there's a reason it's a drawing, there's a reason, well, they weren't photographs at this point in history, but it wouldn't have been allowed because the Christian Israelites followed the Mosaic law. And their leader was known as the Prophet John Roe, who came from Bradford. And when I talk about Mosaic law, you'll all be familiar with the Abrahamic faith, and sort of, for example, they all ate kosher. So they're Christians, but they all had to eat kosher. All the guys were circumcised. They had to wear certain kind of clothes, which you'll all be familiar with. And all the men had to have beards. And at this point in history, in the West, in Britain, guys didn't have beards. It wasn't cool. And the local people actually called them the beardies. So they were a really interesting group of people. And because he'd been semi-adopted by his uncle John, who was second in command after John Roe, he grew up in this community. And this was a fascinating story that I discovered myself just going through the archives. So, again, they felt they were millennialists. So they felt that Christ was about to return. So even though they followed very much Mosaic Abrahamic faith, they were still Christians. They believed that Christ was going to come again to earth in Ashton-under-Lyne. And there's a reason for that. They decided to build the New Jerusalem. So they physically started building a wall around Ashton-under-Lyne without asking the permission of the local people, which was a little bit controversial. And they built gatehouses to symbolise the four corners of Jerusalem. That's one of the gatehouses. It's still standing. Somebody turned it into a pub. There's a pub theme as well in this. But it's still there, which I think is absolutely amazing. So little Robert was brought up right slap bang at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It was a very radical time politically. If you know anything about politics in Britain at this time, it was fiery. Children were down mines and in factories, terrible conditions, absolutely awful conditions. You had Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto, visiting Stalybridge and Ashton in horror at what working people were living like. Let me just go. And one other thing that intrigued me was I found out there was a Hebrew school as well in Ashton, which Robert, I think, went to. And I think this began his interest in religion. He didn't go to school, I should add that as well. Like most working class people, Robert didn't go to school, but he was so well educated. He educated himself. He learned to read and write, and he read everything that he could lay his hands on. So this place on the left is in Stalybridge. That's his home. It's now derelict, unfortunately. I wish I had £1 million. I would buy it and do it up. It was a little shop. He got married to Emma, 1848, and they moved there. He set himself up as a grocer, specialising in tea. And at this point, they'd moved a mile away from Uncle John, and they decided to go to the local Church of England. They were Anglicans, basically. Most of his time was spent on that train to and from Manchester. And the old black and white picture in the middle is the Corn Exchange, which is where he went to buy tea. And this is what I think, he met people from all around the world, tea traders. And he immersed himself. So at the age of 20, 25, he was reading every single newspaper he could get his hand on. And he was really interested in foreign affairs. And obviously, coming from a Christian Israelite background, he was interested in how minorities were treated across the world and British foreign policy. And he would have met people from all around the world at the Corn Exchange. Not in Stalybridge, very white place. You didn't get anybody that didn't look like me in Stalybridge. But only a few miles down the road in Manchester, he was exposed to people who I think would have been saying to him, it's not what don't believe what you're reading in the Times, because I'm telling you in Turkey, this is what's happening. And I think it made him think, which is always a good thing, quite dangerous thing as well. So this is more of interest, really. My mum and dad went to school in Stalybridge and never learnt about this. And I was absolutely shocked when I learnt about the Lancashire cotton famine. And it was literally a famine in Lancashire in the early 1860s. And this was because of President Lincoln's blockade. As you'll know, in the American Civil War, the North were fighting the South, trying to end slavery, trying to emancipate the black people in the South of America. So cotton was what the South was built on, economic might. Lincoln blockaded the cotton. Manchester and Lancashire completely relied on cotton. So for 3 years nearly, cotton did not come from the deep South of America up to Manchester. So all the factories were shutting down. It was mass unemployment. People were starving to death. It was a horrendous time. And I got really interested in this because he was a young man at this point. He and Emma had 11 children together, living in that little 2-bed house I just showed you before, above the shop. So I looked at the census, and censuses are a wonderful thing, for 1861, and I found the actual address he was living at. So it was about 10 shops up. They first moved to this shop at the top of that road. There you go, up the row here. So you'll see now a picture of the actual bread riots. The bread riots broke out because people were starving. And this is Stalybridge. Now, Peterloo happened, I'm sure you know about Peterloo, where people were killed by the soldiers on horseback because they were protesting for their rights in Manchester. This isn't that much later, and they're still doing the same thing. You can still see the soldiers with the swords on the horseback charging at the people. The people were rioting, smashing the windows, trying to get food from the people who owned the shops. Now, obviously, Robert was a grocer, and we actually have the one memory that is passed down from grandfather to grandfather, which Robert said it was so frightening. They had to open their windows and they were throwing bread out to the people below in the hope that they wouldn't set fire to the shop, which is what you can actually see a little bit further down. They set fire to the shops opposite. But the bit that interested me is when I went to look at the census was this. That's my dad and my little boy there. He's a lot bigger now. And that's the actual shop. And that picture there was kept in an old newspaper, but we knew belonged to Roberts, but he never wrote on it. So when I found the address and I looked at that picture, on the left-hand side you can see just above it, it says Canton Tea. That was the tea that he sold. So it was his shop that was being smashed up. So the story that he passed on was true. And he kept that because obviously there were no photographs in 1861 of roads in Stalybridge, but somebody had drawn a picture of it. And that's him saying, that's my shop, that happened to us. So he then became mayor, and this is quite an achievement. He was the first working class mayor that we know of. Because he was so intelligent, we think that he was asked to get involved in civic politics. And it was quite a surprise. I think he was seen to be, he could become a councillor, and he was kind of like a pet poodle. You know, here's an intelligent man of the working classes, he can give something back. Because at this point in history, all of the towns in England were owned by really rich men. And so he got voted in as mayor. There he is. That's the only other photograph that we have of him. Well, actually, that's a fib. There's 3 photographs. One of them was recently was found by somebody else. But the critics found it quite hard to say anything bad about him. The worst thing that the newspapers could say about him was he wasn't old enough, he wasn't fat enough, and he wasn't bald enough to be a mayor. They also didn't like the fact that he was a grocer, and there was a lot of snobbish comments about how grocers were now becoming mayors, and you know, the usual awful attitudes that people tend to have when they feel a bit threatened by another group of people. Even though he was a Tory, much to my parents' shame and horror, he was actually, I suppose, what you would call a one-nation Tory nowadays. And they believed in municipal socialism. So it was acts, I suppose, of kindness and helping the poor have a better life. So they built better water systems. They built beautiful market halls, which he was appointed to build, which is still standing, thank goodness. I'm very proud of the market hall. And they made parks, and they basically introduced health reforms. So the word socialist is a little bit misleading there, because I think he probably thought socialist. So we have some great arguments about this in our family. But he also, this is the bit that astonished me, he told Quilliam he went down to London in 1869 to give evidence. Because at this point in time, in Britain, hardly any working class people had the vote, certainly not women, you know, not till a lot longer down the line. But working class people, if they did have the vote, you had to own a little piece of property if you were working class. That was the only way you could actually have a vote. And you had to go into the market square and put your cross on a board in front of everybody. So everybody knew what you'd voted. And he was really concerned about this, because working class people were beaten, they were bribed, they were taken down the pub, made to get very drunk in order to get the vote of their boss. So the bosses were bribing the workers and mistreating them, and he thought that was really wrong. So he was asked to go to Parliament to give evidence about whether there should be secret ballot, which we all enjoy the benefits of today, or whether it should still be out there in public. Now, he was a really successful mayor, he was extremely popular, and he did some fantastic things, which is all, you know, wonderful to hear if you're an ancestor. But in 1876, he decided to step down as mayor. And this is when life was hard for him, because there was an incident called the Bulgarian atrocities, where hundreds of Christians were massacred by the Turkish army. Absolutely horrific event. And, you know, when you feel that history is repeating itself, he was then under pressure because he'd gotten very interested in the Ottoman world and the empire and the Turks. And clearly, I think by this point, he was interested in the Islamic faith. And there was massive pressure across the country and all mayors to call a meeting to condemn the acts of the Ottoman army. And he refused to do that. And he was under so much pressure to condemn there and call this meeting, and he said, I'm not doing that because you want me to condemn this? Absolutely, it's wrong. And the Sultan himself said he was appalled by what the army had done. He said, but this condemnation of this act is a political thing. You want us all to start hating Muslims, basically. And I've read the newspaper reports of the time, which are horrific. The stuff that was being said by fans of Gladstone against Muslims, you know, they are cannibals, they eat babies, just crazy stuff. I'm reading this thinking, I can't believe that this was being said. And he obviously saw the same thing, and he was really brave. A lot of people turned against him, and by those people I mean the people who basically got him into power in the first place, the rich people who owned the town. Because I think their attitude was, who is this person? How dare he stand up for this? You know, we thought he was in our pocket, and he said, I'm not doing that. So this is a great bit. He left politics and he decided to become a pub owner. So he owned the New Inn in Ashton, and in the left-hand bit of the picture there, it's not the ghost of Robert, it's my dad. We went down to see what the pub looked like, and it's barely changed. And he owned that pub, he ran that pub for 18 years. Then he suddenly sold the pub, 1897/8. And the census tells us he's gone to Manchester. And this is when he met William Abdullah Quilliam, who you're going to hear lots more about, who even I had heard about at this point, thanks to Ron. And he became a member of Britain's first mosque at the Liverpool convert community. There's Quilliam. That's a wonderful illustration, not of Quilliam. And this is how the mosque looked in 1898. And we know from Quilliam's magazine, The Crescent, that Robert said Shahada. He became known as Rashid Stanley in 1898 in the presence of Quilliam. And almost instantly, he was appointed vice president of the mosque, which I just think is amazing. You know, some random bloke from State Liberty turns up and says, oh, you know, I want to become a Muslim. And Quilliam says, you can be the vice president. But he was 28 years older than Quilliam. And I think Quilliam must have had a lot of respect for this elderly gentleman who used to be the mayor of Stalybridge, and of the views that he obviously had about the world and what was going on. So he was part of the same congregation as Fatima Cakes, who you'll hear about later on. So this is what he told Quilliam. You can get that copy of in April 1898 if you're interested online. All the copies of The Crescent are online, thanks to the people at Liverpool. He told Quilliam that he'd lobbied the government. It was a very logical, and dare I say, a very male explanation of why he decided to become a Muslim. It was very logical. It was very persuasive. And he said it was a treatment of Muslims overseas. He'd been writing to the Prime Minister for years about this, and he thought it was wrong. He actually, this is the best bit, he wrote to the Sultan, the head of the Muslim world, himself, from the pub. So he's writing to the Sultan from the pub, and the address would have said the new inn. You could just imagine, you know, Abdul Hamid's face, I'm getting a letter from a pub in Manchester, this is so weird. And he said, we need a copy. This is before he was a Muslim. I need a copy, an English translation by a Muslim that is not biased, written by a Christian. That's what we need. We need a copy of the Quran. And then we get on to Pictol. So you're all familiar with Pictol. So Pictol's a few years later. And he gave him advice on trade and manufacture and agricultural matters. And he just loved writing letters, I think. And he also explained his role in discussing the secret ballots. But 1911, Quilliam left. Ron will probably explain this a little bit more. He left the shores of the UK, and then there was silence. We didn't hear anything else from Quilliam at this point. In 1911, a few years after Quilliam left, is when Robert died. He left Manchester. His wife had died by this point. And Emma, my great-great-grandmother, they were together a long time. They celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. They had 11 children. Robert's youngest daughter basically looked after him in his declining years in Stalybridge. That's the house. It's still there. I would love a blue pack to be on that house. And that's where he died. Just a little two-bed terrace in Stalybridge. So I think this is man. You know, this man just did such amazing stuff in his life, and he still had such a humble background. And he was buried in St Paul's Church in Stalybridge. Now, this is the interesting bit that a lot of my Muslim friends always grill me about. We did not know about this grave. We presumed he was buried probably at another church in Stalybridge, but we never found his grave. And then when my dad decided to start looking into this before I did my own research, we found the grave, and here it is with Emma and one of their babies, their baby son that died. And my dad found that grave 2 months before it was destroyed by the church, because the church wanted to build a car park. So, like Richard III, his body is now under a car park. We asked, could we please do something about this? Could we maybe even have the headstone? And we were told, no, you should have applied months ago. And we said, we didn't even know about this months ago. But his body's still there, and we can honour him by talking about him. And that is what this little headstone here, which was mocked up online. A young man, a 13-year-old boy, heard this story, and he was so moved by it, he went away. This is at one of the mosques in Manchester, and he wrote a poem honouring Rashid. And he said, I was so angry about the gravestone, I wanted to do one online for you. So we all got quite emotional at that point. So finally, questions. There are so many questions remaining, and obviously he isn't here, and the family didn't talk about this, and it was all completely discovered by ourselves. The photograph on your left is some of his children, and his youngest daughter there, who basically nursed him in the last few months of his life. The littlest one there, Alice. And on the right there is his grandson. Now, he basically brought his one of his grandson up, that's Dean. Now that's my grampy, my great-granddad. And my daughter was looking at this picture yesterday and she kept accusing me of lying because she said, you never knew that man. I said, I do, I remember him. I remember at the age of 4 sitting at his feet playing with toys. And she said, but he was a Victorian. And I said, yeah, but he lived till he was 91. So he died when I was 4. I do remember him. And if you zoom in on that picture, you will see he's actually wearing that star and crescent, because I got quite canny with the zooming in at photographs. So I think they're in mourning dress for him there. That photograph was taken in 1911, and in honour of him, he was wearing the star and the crescent, which strangely has come down through the generations which we now have. So we think, and we can only guess, the reason we didn't know about this amazing man and his achievements, other than the fact that he was a mayor and that was wonderful, we think that they reframed the narrative. So I asked my granny, did you not know anything of this story? And she said, no, all I knew was he was a Rechabite. And I said, well, I have no idea what that is. And if you go and Google it, it means somebody who practices temperance, which I think is fantastic for somebody that owned a pub. I'm not sure at what point he practiced temperance, or whether, because obviously the temperance movement was huge. Ron will know all about this. A lot has been written about Quilliam's life and temperance. That's all that the family were told. He didn't drink. At this point in time as well, 1911, we're heading towards World War I. So obviously there was an alignment with the Turks, with the Turkish Empire. Stalybridge, you're not going to want to say, hey, great-granddad, he's a really great friend of the Turks at this point in time. So we think when he died, there was silence. My own feeling as well is Quilliam obviously had several wives, and if your husband is suddenly going off to Liverpool and back, and there's this guy that everybody knows that has several wives, and he's a Muslim, it's all a bit, you don't really want to publicise the fact locally. There might even have been that fear that dad's got another wife down in Liverpool. That's kind of what the women in our family feel might have been some of the things that were being said. No evidence for that, by the way. It's just, what people are like. And he would have been, as Quilliam was, a person of interest to the British intelligence agencies. So I know how conservative with the small C people are in Stalybridge, and my family, they wouldn't really have wanted spies wandering around looking into family affairs. The best thing was to just keep quiet, get through the war, and then forget about it all. So this is family now. This is the same picture as the photograph of the mosque you saw. That's some of my family there. My son's ruining the photo with his red socks as usual. Wonderful place to visit, Liverpool Mosque, if you've never been. Please go. Oops. And there's my dad and my nephews and my brother doing the bodybuilder thing there. But yeah, we're just really proud and just so honoured to have that man in our family. And this is my dad wearing the fez, except the fez is cut off. There's actually a little film of him online on the website if you're interested, so you can just see how much my dad is like Robert Rashid. It's a silent film because my dad would never be able to come and talk like this. He's a very shy person, but he's a wonderful black and white silent movie actor. So those are the books I decided to write about it, and Saeed Avasi very kindly read them and gave an endorsement. And yeah, I'm just really pleased to be here and to tell you a little bit of, I've galloped through his life, there's so much more to say, but thank you for listening. And if you do want to buy any books, they are at the back. And if you don't, please just tell your library to buy them, because then people can read them for free. So that's me doing my bit for the public libraries. So thank you so much for listening.